Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Alex Tapscott, who is an entrepreneur and investor. Alex, you're also, of course, the author. Most recently, I think this is your fourth book, Web3. So nice to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too.
Are you in sunny Toronto right now?
Sunny Toronto, yes. Well, we have a little bit of smoke in the air still from the Quebec wildfires, but yes, it's quite nice out.
So let's start with Web3 because it is a term, of course, we keep hearing. We've been hearing it for some time. You define it for us, in terms of why a book and why now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it turns out that the internet and with it the web are entering a new era known as Web3. And I think it's helpful in order to understand what Web3 is to actually define what Web1 and Web2 are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the internet itself was actually invented in the late 1960s as an initiative of the Department of Defense to create a decentralized communication network that could keep running in the event of a nuclear attack. But it didn't really get commercialized until much later in the 1990s with the invention of the World Wide Web and the web browser. The era that we think of as sort of the .com era, the period that sort of lasted most of the 90s, is what we now refer to as the so-called read web or Web 1. And basically at the time, the web was kind of like
eyeballs, right? It was
eyeballs. It was all about broadcast medium, very much like almost like TV and radio. A lot of the iconic businesses of the .com era were in a way sort of versions of what came before, right? Things like encyclopedias or news sites and so forth. It was a way to consume content. And even though it was kind of primitive by today's standards, it was nevertheless revolutionary because it democratized access to internet, at least for people who had an internet connection, which was relatively few people. And that's how the web progressed for a period of time. In the early 2000s, the combination of the crash of the .com and also the introduction of some new technologies created the conditions for a new kind of web to emerge, what we now describe as Web 2 or the read-write web. So not only was the web a way to consume information, it was actually a tool that allowed us to upload our own data, to reprogram the web, to build communities, and to collaborate online. So it went from what you can think of as like a broadcast medium to more of a social medium.
Right.
And the defining businesses of Web 2, I think most people would agree, are social media companies.
Yeah, the Facebooks, the Googles, actually less the Googles, but definitely, I agree.
Yeah, Facebook, Instagram, and also with the rise of the smartphone, a lot of geospatial applications, things like Uber, and Airbnb, TaskRabbit, and so on and so forth. And what was really remarkable about Web 2 is it democratized publishing. So anybody could be, a photo blogger, anybody could be a citizen journalist, anybody could, post their opinions, for better or for worse.
Right.
And that was important, I think, and overall a big positive. But what ended up happening was that all of this user-generated content created enormous amounts of value, but not necessarily for the individuals who created it, but rather for the large platforms who took this groundswell of engagement and built these closed-off, gated, communities where you as a user created lots of data, but the platform ended up extracting that and capturing a lot of the value. And I think now a lot of people look back at this Faustian bargain, if you will, the idea of trading our data for access to free services as sort of a raw deal. And I think at this point in time, you could make the case that the web needs a rethink. And fortunately, we now have the technology tools to have that rethink, and that's the promise of Web 3. So Web 3,
blockchain, and tell us a little bit about those tools.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe as a quick diversion, we can talk about blockchains for a second. I think most people associate blockchains.
I see beside your head there. Is that that's your symbol of the blockchain?
Yes, exactly. Yes, absolutely. Well, if the first era of the web was the read web and the second era of the web is the read-write web, then you can think of Web 3 as the read, write, and own web, or the web of ownership. So not only is the web a way to consume content, not only is it a way to publish information and to create community online, but it's actually a way for us to own the digital assets, the native assets of the digital age. And that is things like our data, our identities, our virtual goods, and our digital assets. So things like money and other financial goods.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really important shift. The first two eras of the web you can think of as being the eras of the Internet of Information, where Internet users were exactly that, users. We're now shifting to a new paradigm where Internet users are becoming Internet owners. All of that is only possible because of blockchains. Until blockchains came about, we actually had no way of representing value digitally, right? So if you think about how we use the internet, if I send you, an email, for example, with a PDF attachment, I can send that same email to a million other people. So when it comes to information, that's useful. I have a printing press for information. But if that email included, some money, it's important that when you receive it, you've got the only version. And I can't send the same money to someone else. Because if I can copy money, like I can copy information, then the money becomes worthless. So we had no way of creating digital scarcity to crystallize property rights online.
And the trust economy, as some people term it, right? Like that's one of the benefits of blockchain, is that whole element of trust and ownership that is hard to replicate in the earlier eras.
Exactly. And what blockchains do is create a decentralized, trustless platform for moving and storing value online. And that value online can be things like Bitcoin, which is sort of the first example of blockchain, but it can be almost anything of value. We use this term token to describe digital assets. And it sounds, whimsical, almost trivial, a token of appreciation. But actually the word token is really appropriate. And you can think of tokens basically as containers for value. They are these empty vessels that you can program to represent anything. It could be money, it could be stocks and bonds, or art and collectibles, or votes, or even aspects of your identity. So with the read, write, own web, we have a new toolkit to represent ownership of the most fundamental assets online for the very first time. And that is a huge shift forward.
Let me pause for a minute here, because I think there's two elements in terms of the audience that we're reaching. So I think that's an excellent primer or primer, as the British would say, in terms of where we are today. But people who've been in the space, we're all too aware of the fact that we've also come through what some would term a crash. We've certainly seen a lot of issues with crypto, some degree of skepticism with some elements of blockchain. So how does that factor into it? Of course, there was a crash between, Web 1.0 and 2.0, but all of the technology you're talking about thus far has also been a bit fraught and has certainly come under the radar of the SEC in terms of, at least in terms of the, the payment parts of this new revolution. The regulators are taking notice. So give us some sense of what's happening there for those who know what it is and who are really wondering how all these other factors are starting to shape it. What would you say?
Yes,
in 30 seconds or less. I'm just kidding.
Well, technology is cyclical. Technology is cyclical. That's been true for forever. And even as late as last year, the expectation was we were nearing the end of a cycle of technology innovation and investment because of rising interest rates. And Web3 was caught up in that for a time. And a lot of detractors pointed to the collapse of FTX, for example, as evidence that this technology, while useful in the hands of governments and central banks and maybe some big companies, was a net negative when left to the free market. It created new ways for speculators to gamble, and it created new ways for criminals to evade law enforcement. In actuality, we can blame the collapse of companies like FTX not on the technology itself, but on the hubris of those who were building it. And that's been true of technology, honestly, throughout history.
Sure.
I mean, the oldest technology, like fire, can be used to cook food and heat your home, but it can also be used to, burn down a city. And that's true for every technology, really. I mean, the internet in its early days, people said was simply a tool for criminals and pornographers because they were users of the technology, just as bad people use fire, drive cars, and use this technology too. But, the collapse of any single company in the space doesn't typically mean it's the end of the industry. The age of exploration did not end with the first failed voyage.
Yeah.
the Industrial Revolution didn't end with the many panics that happened in the 19th century where banks and railroads went under. And we didn't call it quits on the internet in 2001 after the crash.
Yep.
So it's often actually after these periods where the tide comes out and interest dips, where a lot of the big innovation happens throughout history. And I think that's going to be true here as well.
So where, you're an optimist, and I understand why, because you're talking about fundamental technology shifts. It's interesting when I talk to leaders, the conversation has shifted from blockchain and crypto. It's still there, of course, and there's no question it's going to transform processes to this whole generative AI. How does that factor into this revolution, or is it really, noise at this point to what you're talking about?
Well, I think the two are centrally and inexorably linked, actually.
Okay.
Right now, we're on the brink of this really interesting age where technology is reimagining basically everything that's possible. Mm-hmm. And throughout history, technologies have come along which have transformed the economy and culture in some really crazy ways. And we've seen that recently with the internet, but before that, computing and the radio and the steam engine and so on and so forth. And now we're at this really interesting stage where there's not one, but several new technologies all kind of emerging at once. So generative AI and large language models like ChatGPT are not just doing raw computation. They're writing poetry and music and creating art. They are enhancing human capability in new and maybe scary ways. You're seeing the rise of the Internet of Things, of billions or trillions of connected devices forming the infrastructure for our connected world. You're seeing the rise of virtual reality and augmented reality. Apple just released its Vision Pro. And it's possible that...
What do you think of that, by the way? Do you think it's going to go the way of the Google Glass? I mean, it's not the most attractive.
No, I don't. I don't. Virtual reality, what's really interesting about all these technologies that I'm describing is that they're all overnight success stories 50 years in the making.
Right.
I mean,
as is true
AI,
for a lot of things, right?
That is true, right? So the AI scares, we've had AI scares dating back to the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, Alan Turing, the inventor of the computer, actually raised concerns about, the singularity before that was the term we used to describe when computers exceed human intelligence. And when it comes to virtual reality and augmented reality, I mean, there have been versions of that for 30 or 40 years. But they say there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come again. Well,
I think what's interesting with Web3, they almost seem a little bit, maybe I'm wrong about them being inextricably linked, because one of the biggest concerns about AI, in addition to displacing jobs, is that ability to create deep fakes and what it does to erode the trust economy. The factors that we've been talking about with blockchain, et cetera, really is to reinforce the trust economy. I don't want to hone in too much on trust, but to what extent do you feel they're synergistic in terms of where the money's to be made and how to think about, frankly, developing a business in this new age?
Well, what's really interesting is probably the most famous AI person in the world, except for maybe Ray Kurzweil, is Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI. Right? The creator of ChatGPT. He has two projects going on right now. One is called OpenAI, and the other one is called WorldCoin. So he's got an AI project and a Web3 project. And both are deeply intertwined with one another. So he is very concerned with the exact issue that you've raised, which is in a world of deep fakes where we can recreate how people look and sound, how do you prove your humanness? How do you make sure that when it's you, people know that it's you? And you need some kind of unique identifier to do that. So WorldCoin
is not a blue check mark.
That's not a blue check mark, which is pretty easy to fool, right? I mean, actually, I think the blue check mark thing's been a disaster, frankly. Anybody can use my name, change one letter, and get a blue check mark and impersonate pretty easily.
Agreed.
So I'm not sure the WorldCoin uses a retinal scan and as a way to prove individual people. I'm not sure that's necessarily the model, but basically what they're trying to do is create a system where every single person can prove their humanness without giving away any information about themselves, using a thing called a zero knowledge proof, which is a core building block actually of Web3, and use that as a way to access services to prove who they are, and maybe eventually receive sort of dividends or the windfall from AI. So if AI goes on to displace jobs and create all sorts of new wealth in the economy, being a user of this platform will entitle you to a share of the windfall. So what's interesting to me is that you're seeing the convergence, or what I would argue is the trivergence of three different technologies, right? So there's AI, which is the logic or reasoning layer for this new web. There's blockchains and Web3, which you can think of as sort of the commercial or transactional layer, right? A way to represent value and conduct business peer-to-peer. And then you've got the Internet of Things, the idea that we have trillions of connected devices. I mean, the WorldCoin project itself actually uses a retinal scanning orb that they hope to deploy widely around the world. So you can think of that as almost a synergy of these three different categories coming together as one. Another really interesting example with AI, since you asked about synergies, I'll just say briefly.
Yep, of course.
Large language models are only as useful as the data that goes into them. And
garbage in, garbage out.
Garbage in, garbage out. And you know what? The garbage in, garbage out creates lots of problems. One of them is that AI models are trained with inherent bias, right? Which is why they may actually perpetuate a lot of the prejudices that humans have because of the data that goes into it. But another issue is where did this data come from? What is its provenance? Who owns it? Is there IP that's copyright protected that is being fed into this model? And how do we think about those issues? And so with blockchains, with Web3, there's a number of different interesting projects. One's called the Ocean Protocol, to basically watermark data that goes into these devices, into these large language models. They're not literally physical devices, but this software, to ensure that if data gets used for some economic purpose, that the creator actually gets fairly compensated. And I think that's a really fascinating example as well.
So let me stand back a second, because I want to acknowledge, the first books you've written were with your dad, Don Tapscott, who I've known for years. And I think one of the beauties of the books you've co-written with him, and also him with Microtrends, is really that soothsayer aspect of, here's the landscape, but also here are the trends to watch, and here are the potential perils that people will trip into. In terms of, so let me ask you, what have you learned from him in terms of how to look at the landscape and connect the dots? Because everybody tries to do it, but you've had the chance to have a front row seat in somebody who frankly is one of the best in the world at it. So give us some insights as to what you've, you're welcome, Don, but how do you look at the world differently, you think, having gotten his advice?
Well, I never thought that he and I would be working together. I graduated from university and I went into investment banking and had a career there for like 7 years. But it was in 2014 that I first learned about Bitcoin, before the word Web3 or blockchain or any of these other things entered the vernacular. And I was actually on a ski trip with my dad in Quebec at Mont Tremblant, which is the big ski hill there. And over a steak dinner and some poutine, he asked me, what are you looking at these days? What are you interested in? And I told him about Bitcoin. And he said, that's really interesting because we're trying to do a project on Bitcoin. At the time, he was running this research initiative called the Global Solution Networks Program at the University of Toronto. Yeah. And he had nobody in his research team that had any financial services experience or any, sort of deep acumen about Bitcoin. This is at a time, by the way, when most people didn't know anything about Bitcoin, and I was certainly no expert. But I had an interest. You could
buy a burger for a Bitcoin, I think, at that point, right?
Maybe an expensive.
Maybe
burger.
not. Maybe
it was actually like $150. It was like $150 a Bitcoin
when
I first looked at it. A couple of like Wagyu beef burgers or something like that. He and I started collaborating on this report while I was still doing my day job. But the deeper I went, the more convinced I became that this was not just some new financial technology or new asset class. This was the start of something much bigger. I didn't know what yet, but it was enough to convince me to take a leap of faith. So yes, he and I together wrote a book called Blockchain Revolution. It came out in 2016. better lucky than smart, they say. It was the timing was very good. It was right around when a lot of people in the business community and the financial community wanted to understand this thing, but didn't have a useful text to use. And so we kind of provided that book that everyone could use to get a footing in the market. Working with my dad has been eye-opening for a lot of reasons. We've often complemented each other. I mean, he has deep. He's a prolific author, obviously, but he also understands business management and theory extremely well. He's not actually as strong, and he would admit this, in the financial world. When it comes to asset management or investment banking or capital markets and the structure of marketplaces, and that's something that I've been working on my whole life. So it was a highly synergistic collaboration. With the new book, with Web3, I'm looking to build on the work that we've done together. When we first wrote that book, the entire value of all digital assets in the world was like $10 billion, right? So if it was a publicly traded company, it would have been, as big as Under Armour, The Gap, because
Right.
it's relatively small business. Today, it's $1 trillion, and there are not just one or two types of digital assets like currencies. There are dozens of new types of assets, and so this has really become, to me, the most exciting economic frontier online. But what has surprised me a lot in the research is also how it's as much a cultural frontier as an economic frontier. And actually,
You mean about the decentralized innovation? Because it's not a Silicon Valley only, innovation anymore.
Yeah.
You're in Toronto,
Well,
Toronto,
that is-
Montreal have been huge.
Yeah, that is certainly true. Toronto, for a period, was a leader in this area. Ethereum, which most people probably know, is the second largest blockchain platform. It's got a digital native asset called Ether. It was started by a group of Canadians in Toronto, but this isn't even something that's just happening in the West per se. They used to say that Silicon Valley is like a tech Galapagos for the unique blend of talent and capital and government funding and resources that led to that peculiar species of founder that created all those big tech companies. An island of innovation, right, or an archipelago of innovation. Today is very different. Technology tools are way more distributed. Talent is way more distributed. Innovation is happening everywhere. It's not just in the U.S. or even the U.S., Canada, and places like it. I've traveled over the last 5 years to 40 countries. I've visited every continent except Antarctica. They haven't brought me there.
Not a lot
yet,
of AI.
but-
Probably is a lot of AI there actually with climate change, but I digress.
Well, who knows? I do know that there's like if not a Bitcoin ATM, there's some sort of thing happening at one of those like research facilities. But going to all these places is a reminder that a U.S.-centric view of the world is extremely limited when it comes to technology innovation, especially today. A lot of work has been done by a group called Chainalysis, which shows that adoption of a lot of Web3 tools, digital assets, and so forth is way more common in places like Thailand and Vietnam and Ukraine and Nigeria and Venezuela than it is in most
So they're
Western European.
leapfrogging. It's almost like M-Pesa in Kenya, right? You have the opportunity to leapfrog. That was mobile payments. Let me ask you. Obviously this is teaser content for the book, but a few quick questions. One, from your travels, is the U.S. at risk of being left behind in some ways, either because of the regulatory response or that somewhat narrow worldview?
Well, we'll see about that. I think that whereas the U.S. in the past, it's been theirs to lose because of all of those things that made Silicon Valley a tech Galapagos. This time it's very different. And what we're seeing right now in the U.S. is interesting. At the same time that the securities regulator has taken a very broad approach to this new asset class and is trying to, basically say that almost any new innovation in the space is under their mandate, we're seeing other parts of the world take a very different approach. In the UK, for example, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, recently said that he wants to make the UK the Web3 capital of the world. In the United Arab Emirates, they've announced the launch of a multi-billion-dollar fund to support innovation and attract entrepreneurs. Even in Hong Kong and mainland China, which historically has been somewhat reluctant to embrace this stuff, we're seeing a thawing there. So I don't want to overstate what's going on as if this is some big power shift that's happening in the world, but I do think that the U.S. mentally at risk of missing out on this. And why is that important? Well, if this new era of the web is anything like past eras of the web, it's going to create untold wealth, many jobs, and new innovations that I think the U.S. probably thinks it has a vested interest in maintaining a lead in, right? What is the U.S. the leader in? The U.S. is leader in, several areas, including things like obesity, but also things like technology and financial services. And this is a technology tool that hits both of those head on.
Would there be any companies on your radar that you would put on ours? I mean, because each, it's like we're at this period where there's 100 car companies, and from that emerge, the top 3. Is that likely to happen here? Certainly people look at, you mentioned Sam Altman, OpenAI being one of the big winners, certainly thus far in terms of generative AI. Who are some of the players, or is it too early to say, that really could be the next wave of titans from what you see?
It's such an interesting question for several reasons. In the 1990s, Wall Street analysts were convinced that there were a group of excellent businesses that everyone needed to own. They had, great management teams and deep moats, and they had, loyal customers. Companies like Kodak and Polaroid and, Tower Records and Sears Roebuck and Macy's and so on and so forth. But what every single one of those companies had in common was that they were all about to be disintermediated in a way by the internet. And that doesn't mean that they were doomed to fail, by the way. It just meant that they didn't fully embrace Web1, as it was called, when they had the chance. And I think that this time it's very similar. There are lots of existing companies out there that we might say today are, strong in their respective industries, but might be disintermediated by Web3. There are also going to be new champions, to your point. There are going to be new kinds of companies that emerge and new kinds of projects. One thing I think that is different is that, unlike in the past, value is getting created both at the company level, but also at the protocol level. And I know that sounds a bit jargony, but basically things like Ethereum, for example, aren't really corporations, right? They're not at all corporations. They are decentralized networks that are self-maintaining using a token, right? And that token value of Ethereum is worth more than all the companies in Web3 combined. Ethereum's got a market value of around $200 billion US. Coinbase, which is an excellent company, and one of the leading on-ramps into this asset class, listed on the
I have to ask, are you an investor in Coinbase?
I actually can't comment on that. I'm not allowed to say it.
I don't want to say excellent company and leave that like, well, wait a second there. Okay.
Well, by excellent company, I simply mean they've done a great job of onboarding tens of millions of people, and I think have operated in a really strong
certainly
way.
Democratized access, right, to a lot of this stuff.
But even still, just to finish the thought, like Coinbase is a tenth the size of Ethereum, right? So I think a lot of value accrual in Web3 is actually not going to necessarily happen in companies. It's going to happen in protocols.
Okay, good. Well, listen, the book is Web3. More to come. Anything else that's on your radar, Alex, right now in terms of the perils? Because obviously these are times where a lot of money's made, but it's also times where people trip up. What advice do you have tactically at this stage from your research for people to avoid or look for?
Well, I think that the risk of inaction is much greater than the risk of action, for one. And I think that for most people who I hope will read the book, a lot of them haven't really even begun their Web3 journey. So I think that that's the starting point you have to go with. And I think that the advice is different depending on who you are. I mean, if you're a student, I think you're luckiest of them all. Like, you have an opportunity to become an expert in emerging technologies and be a leader, in an organization from day one. And I think that's kind of exciting. If you're an existing business leader, you've got to think about both how this could disrupt your business, but also how you could harness this technology in the way that a lot of great companies took advantage of the web, right?
Right.
If you're in government, you've got a very difficult thing that you have to figure out. On the one hand, you want to make sure you protect consumers and penalize wrongdoers. but you also want to create the conditions for innovation to work in your country. I hope, right? You're trying to create jobs and grow your tax base and create prosperity. So you've got to figure out how to navigate that as well. I think the first thing that everyone should think about doing is just to get started. And the best way to do that is by pre-ordering my book. No,
there you go. There's the plug. Okay.
I had
can't
to do
think
it.
of a better place to end
I have
there.
a book.
It's not out till September, but this is certainly, I think, a good baseline, and I'm sure much will change given the speed at which this is happening. So, Alex, thank you for joining us, and good luck. Look forward to future conversations.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks.